This Quoircast Podcast episode is brought to you by the Messy Spirituality Podcast. Hey, this is Jason Elam. Join Lola Robbins, Kyle Butler, and me for the Messy Spirituality Podcast, where we try to empower your spiritual evolution with honest conversation about how to be a better human, taking a critical look at toxic Bible stories, and look behind the headlines for growth opportunities underlying current events. Hey, it's a bisexual hairstylist who escaped a cult, a black mystic, and a recovering Southern Baptist preacher. What could possibly go wrong? Check out the Messy Spirituality Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
All right. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney. I'm joined as always by my brother John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And this is the podcast we call This Is Not Church, because if it was church, you'd have left by now. Hey, but I need to actually start having Eric throwing like a little rim shot for that line. That's a good line. I mean, if it was church, or maybe that's not the case. Maybe if this was church, you'd be like, oh, finally, I'm home at a church where people sometimes cuss and usually, drink a little. And
I'm getting ready to update our merch site, and I'm going to put up a shirt for that says "This is not church" on the front, and on the back it'll say, because if it was, you would have left by now. So that'll be our new shirt. So anyone who wants shirts, we will have that soon.
And we need to market some shot glasses.
Oh, yeah. Beer glasses.
For sure.
Oh, yeah.
That's fair. But anyway, we digress. That's the other one, John. That was not even intentional. This is not church podcast, ... We digress. We are here with a guest who will be a first for us. We've had lots of authors, activists, and musicians and all kinds. I don't think we've had a poet.
Nope. This is a first.
I think we've had some people who maybe sometimes, I know Brian Zahnd dabbles in poetry, but I would not call him a poet.
Right.
There's poetry that he's written in some of his books, but I think it's a stretch. Brian, you're stretching a little bit. But that being said, Darrell Epp is part of the Quoir family, as are John and I. And so we both, and as is this podcast, part of the Quoircast network. So we're big fans of Quoir and all that they do. And so Darrell's new book has come out on Quoir. It's called Permanent Smoke, and it's a book of poetry. But Darrell Epp's poetry has appeared in over 100 magazines on, I almost said 9 continents. Are there even 9 continents?
I don't think so.
That sounds good.
I like it.
He's appeared. His most recent one has appeared in Antarctica, which the flat earthers will tell you doesn't exist, or it's an ice wall around our flat planet. We should talk about that. That would be interesting. Anyway, he's performed readings and conducted writers' workshops across the UK, USA, and Canada. And this is his fifth. See, John, every time you set me up like, hey, Matt's going to read the bio because he does a better job. I stumble through the whole effing thing. But this is his 5th poetry collection. And he lives by the western tip of Lake Ontario. You live on the U.S. side, or is there no, you said the western tip. So my geography sucks. Is that like Michigan? Ohio? Are you in Canada? Are you in Texas?
Well, how many guesses would you like to have?
I would need 17 guesses. And even then, I'm not sure. Let's see, Lake Ontario. I got nothing, man.
Okay. What if I said I am exactly half in the middle between Buffalo and Toronto?
Look at Ness. Ness is like, that doesn't help me at all.
So I'm going to say, Western New York?
Wow.
Southern Ontario.
So you're in Canada.
Yeah.
Canada.
All right.
I live in Hamilton, Ontario. And
now here's David Hayward. Okay. David Hayward lives in Hamilton, Ontario.
Okay.
The Naked Pastor. Yeah, the guy who draws all the amazing, awesome cartoons. If you haven't heard of him, you should. He lives in Hamilton, I believe. I drove through Hamilton a couple of years ago on my way across. I had driven up from Detroit, and I'd driven up into Toronto, and then made my way around the Niagara. So anyway, I've been through that area. My geography is still typical American, and I suck.
My only claim, I think I've had a beer from a brewery in Hamilton, but I couldn't tell you the name of the brewery. That's my connection.
I know there's several breweries here. There's one down by the water called Collective Arts Brewing. I can't remember the name of the one they have, but yeah, we have a lot of beer here for sure. Yeah.
Well, that's cool. So you are our first poet, but like our 15th Canadian. We do deep dives into Canada quite a bit. Some of our favorite people are Canadian, so that's awesome. Okay. We are. In fact, isn't Barton Breen from that area too? Anyway,
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. All right, Barton, if you're listening, don't be upset that I don't remember exactly. I think that's the part of Canada he's from, though. Regardless, we're glad you're here, man. I appreciate you taking the time. If you wouldn't mind, maybe just walk us through a little bit of your background. I know your bio touched on the poetry and stuff, but maybe just your background, your religious background, whatever, just to kind of bring us up to speed.
Yeah, sure. So in the 1990s, I worked in the theater where I trained actors, where I would write plays and then also be like an assistant director. And that was a real sort of meaningful experience for me, where at one time we would give actors level exercises where we would have people, imagine if you walked in a circle around me and I insulted you over and over again until you got to the point where you wanted to hit me. And I said, okay, let's call that a 10. Now let's do this scene, but give me a 4. And then we do the scene again, and I say, give me a 7. So that was a really interesting time in terms of seeing about how, you could write something and think you know what it meant because you wrote it. But then you see how the meaning changes depending on the blood sugar level of the actors or gesture and posture and all these things. So that was a really fun time. And then I couldn't quite figure out how to make money in the theater in this part of the world. So I thought, let's do the classic, have a stooge day job, then write at night. And then I always thought I'd write, novels, science fiction novels, because that's what I grew up on. And then by the time I got serious about it, it turned out the whole world had turned into science fiction.
Yeah.
Reality beat me to it, where if you were alive in 1995, how much of your day today would strike your 1995 self as science fiction? So I thought that was interesting. And I spent some time looking for a form of writing that would be up to the challenges of talking about how we live today. And myself, I like to read Edith Wharton and Henry James for pleasure. But it turns out if you want to talk about 2023 to people in 2023, a Victorian novel of manners where you spend 7 pages describing how a lady folds her napkin, might not be the best way. Right?
Fair enough.
And it turned out I went to poetry as a vacation and just kind of stayed there. And it turned out there was something about it that was so satisfying, where writing a good poem, writing a poem isn't hard because the bar is so low. Anyone can write something to their mom and their mom will like it. So they can say they're a poet. And also, nobody knows enough to say, no, that's not a poem. Go home, right? But writing a really good poem is really challenging. And for me, that's part of the fun. And I like the idea of writing something and not knowing if I can do it, not knowing where it's going. And that spontaneity and that joy is really what propels the book forward. And I was always a big believer in, if I'm writing a book and I'm surprised by how it turns out, there's a much better chance the reader is going to be surprised. And then along the way, it turned out if you get good at writing poetry, really good, it's actually a pretty accurate way to simulate states of consciousness and what it's like to be alive. About, let's say you're walking to a store, you are being bombarded by all this sense data that your limbic system orders pretty quickly before it gets to the front part of your brain so that you don't get hit up by a car. But also at the same time, you're remembering random things, thinking, why did I remember that? I didn't know I was thinking about her. Suddenly I'm thinking about her. That's weird. So in a poem, you can, if you have rhythm and meter and some elegance to the lines, you're allowed to jump around in a way that you wouldn't be able to do in a straight prose narrative, but also I think does a better job of talking about what it's like to be alive. So my first 4 books were published in Canada, and my 5th book was published by Quoir. And how I came to Quoir is kind of a funny story too. Let's just say I'm very happy with Quoir. So here we are.
All right. Well, wait a minute. You can't tee us up with how you came to Quoir as a funny story and then not tell us a story. So how did you cross paths with those folks? Well,
I spent a lot of time on the internet, which I hear is popular with the young people these days. And
I've heard that too. Yeah, it's a fad though. It's passing.
Canada and America are very different, which you might have heard about. And I wasn't too happy with certain things that happened with my last book. So I had met Keith Giles on Facebook or something. So I mentioned something to him. And then he said, why not try my guy? And it was kind of funny where I don't want to, be a drama queen, but it was kind of like picture an abusive relationship where you can't picture a way out. And then I just thought, wow, I never thought of that. Okay, what do I have to lose, right? And so when we were putting the book together with Quoir, there were certain things that Matt and Keith did that you could really tell that they wanted to sell books, that they were serious, So they made these cool YouTube videos to promote the book and just really kind of went the extra mile. And I was having some culture shock during the process because it was just a very different vibe. And I mean culture shock in a good way. So the book looks great. People like it. And I've actually had more readers. So, it's win-win, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It seems like that'd be no disrespect to the genre, but it seems like that's a tough sell anyway, right? I mean, poetry is kind of a niche market in some ways. I was going to ask you about, it seems like the level of poetic literacy, even in both Canada and the US, is lower than it probably was 50 or 100 years ago, right?
Well, there's a few ways to answer that. My poetry sells better than a lot of poetry because I've done a lot of events at libraries and stuff, really getting out there and pushing it and working on the performance side of things. And also my poetry has humor in it, which people like, and has a conversational tone. But at the same time, and then it is true that poetry isn't exactly, selling as many tickets as Aquaman or something. But that's all kind of a crapshoot in the sense that if you want to write a book and you say, I want this book to be a bestseller, there are certain universal laws that will make sure it doesn't happen. Like the big, best-selling book, like Harry Potter, like J.K. Rowling, she wrote that when she was on welfare, and it was a story that was meaningful for her, and people responded to it. But if you have this crass desire to be a big shot, it just doesn't work that way. So, success is so random, and there are great books that tank every day, where you may as well just filter that out and just, go for the thing that really gets you excited.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like anything else, isn't it? I mean, you're from Canada, so I can bring up the band Rush, and I can say, I'm a huge fan of Rush. And when they were, on the cusp of being booted by their label, they had a choice to produce a more mainstream album or say, screw it, and go balls to the wall with the most epic sort of concept, weird, avant-garde thing they could come up with. And they were like, yeah, if we're going to go out, let's go down swinging. So I get that. I get that tendency to say, no, I'd rather pursue this fully in a way that's meaningful to me than try and just produce something that might sell a bunch, right? Because like you said, either way, it's a crapshoot, right?
And it's funny, like around where I live, by the way, there are all sorts of high schools where Rush played concerts in the high school gym.
Yeah,
and
it's amazing.
And it's funny, I actually grew up in a town called St. Catharines, which is halfway between Hamilton and Niagara Falls. And at the north end of town, where the Welland Canal empties into Lake Ontario, is the actual lakeside park, where they have this ancient carousel that you could ride for a nickel. And that's where the Rush song, Lakeside Park, is based on.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's just a comparison that dropped in my mind. I mean, I mostly just that idea of sticking true to something that you're passionate about, right? Rather than pursuing the sale. And I think it's awesome. It looks like your book's actually doing really well. I was just looking at it on Amazon. It looks like you're doing great.
Yeah. Apparently on the actual release date, it was #1 on Amazon America in the category of Canadian poetry. And so there was a brief moment when the book was actually ahead of Leonard Cohen's book.
Wow.
So I think someone got a screenshot of that, because otherwise no one will believe it. But it did happen for like 3 hours, I think, until,
Hey, I'm telling you, grab those brass rings when they come by, man. I love Leonard Cohen too, man. That's great company to be in. But John, you had some questions about like processes and stuff like that about writing poetry, because John here's a poet.
No.
But he doesn't know it.
Ha ha ha.
No, I'm not going to say it. Not going to talk about Longfellow. Go ahead, man.
Well, I was just gonna, I do have, I obviously I have some interest in other poets' process, right? So, I kind of an out. The poetry I write, I limit myself to length. So I inevitably, I don't think I write good poetry, because some of my favorite poems are, quite longer, with a lot of depth to them. So my poems are usually shorter. I've written a book, and at the end of each chapter, I wrote a poem to connect the chapter I wrote. But my question was, kind of twofold. One is, do you have a specific process? So for me, the process is, if I can get a really good first line, it kind of opens up my conscience, or I don't know what you want to call it, but it takes that first line to get me going. And until I get that one that is like, okay, this is it. This is the opening line that's going to make this poem work. I really can't write anything. And I was just interested in what your process is, and how you get to the point where you can write that poem. Or is it like you have do you do an outline? How do you do it?
Caffeine is a big part of it. Basically, one thing I have to say off the top is, normally when I do my writers' workshops, people ask for advice. I'll say to the people, they haven't read enough. And so many people who show me their writing, you can tell that they don't know enough about what's been done in the field, in the guild that they're trying to join, where I've literally said to people, you can't do this. This book's been written already. You know how if you're having surgery, your anesthesiologist, you don't want an anesthesiologist who's 18. And you don't want an anesthesiologist who's 38. You want an anesthesiologist who has like decades and decades of experience, because it's really important, right? And I always think, like, if you are, arrogant enough to think some stranger should spend time thinking about the thoughts that you wrote, you should expect to have done a long apprenticeship, which involves, in my case, loitering in libraries for many, many years, and just going through the stacks and trying to get up to speed on, Western literature and this guild, and really be inspired, but also want to be worthy of joining this guild. So that's an important thing to say. Also, everything's easier when you're young, where when I was young, I'd be walking in the street and an idea would just pop in my head, right? But then when you're older, it doesn't happen quite that way, where first lines, like you said, are really important. And if I take the first line with the caffeine, normally, once I start putting my thoughts into a line, the line, which is this building block, has such elegance built into it that this forward momentum suddenly happens, where I wrote all this prose fiction, and then once I went to poetry and did readings, I thought, oh, wow, this is really important. The big difference in poetry, first off, is a good poem is supposed to be processed via the ear. And before you write a poem where you tell me the meaning of life, your poem has to be pleasing to the ear. That's job one. Like Gerard Manley Hopkins and W.H. Auden, they both said that. And they were the best and the most, and like full of meaning and skill. But they said, before you tell me the meaning of life, it has to be pleasing to the ear, right? So then when I did these readings, I thought, yeah, anyone who's going to read my poetry, they're familiar with rock music. And in rock music, if you say bebop lula, gabba gabba hey, you don't say, what's it mean? You just say, okay, I get it, right? Because rhythm and meter allows you to get away with so much. And there's all these phrases in Shakespeare and the King James Bible that you can't forget, even if you wanted to, because of rhythm and meter, right? So Franz Kafka said, life has meaning because it ends. And if you live forever, it couldn't be meaningful because the fact it ends is where it gets its music from. So a poem has a beginning, middle, and end, and a line has a beginning, middle, and end. So once you start taking your scribblings and structuring them into a stack of lines, sometimes you'll be surprised. So there have been times in my life when I sat down and said, oh, I'm a genius, and I wrote a poem in one go. But now I'm at the point where I'll actually have to schedule a day where I'll say to myself, okay, just fill up this notebook with scribbling, right? And just write something, whatever you're interested in. And when you look at it and you think to yourself, is this stupid? Say to yourself, that's not today's problem. Okay. Today's problem is just to fill this page and then go back the next day and start sculpting it. Right. So, recently I wrote a poem that was 1 page long, and I started off being 7 pages because I kept on figuring out about different ways to phrase this guy going downstairs and what was the best, most pleasing way to do that. So sometimes you can write a poem and say, oh, wow, I'm a genius. I nailed it. But as you go along, it's quite possible most of the magic will be in the editing.
I kind of agree with you on that. I mean, I think a lot of people who I don't want to say they think they're poets because that seems kind of derogatory and mean, but yeah, okay, that they aspire to be poets. They think that poetry in some way is spontaneous. Like, right, the muse hits you, you write this beautiful poem and you send it out to the world and the world just enjoys it because it was this spontaneous moment of joy and whatever. But there's a lot of editing and there's a lot of thought process to writing a good poem that I think a lot of people think that poets are just these esoteric, which they are. I'm not saying they're not, but that editing isn't part of the process. And I think what you just said, turning a 7-page poem into a 1-page poem is an example of, having a really clear idea of your art, right?
Yeah. And also, there are people like you're describing where they'll say to you, I wrote this poem. It's about my feelings, so it can't be bad. How can you criticize it? That's what I really felt, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, if I was your mom, that'd work because your mom likes everything you do, right? But if you really want to graduate to the point where strangers will actually read your stuff, don't just write for your mom. Like that's kind of like, like bunting or something, right? And it's also like a misapprehension, like you said, about how art works. Like it isn't just like, oh, wow, the muse appeared and inspired me and I scribbled this down and look how awesome it is, right? And that's really not how it works. And, it does take a lot of effort and training and work, right?
And in no other art form do we expect that, right? I mean, in no other art form, be it a novelist, a musician, a painter, nowhere else would we expect that the first draft of anything is going to be perfection. So why do we expect that poetry has to fall into this idea that, well, I got this muse, I had this idea, I wrote it down, it's perfect. I mean, it seems kind of asinine, really.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. Like if you look at someone who can draw as well as like Robert Crumb, it's like, he wasn't kidding. He wasn't in it for the glory or the ego boost. He spent his whole life staring at his hand, 12 hours a day for like decades, right? So, this idea that like some girl dumped you and you wrote a poem about it and it's a masterpiece, that's like winning the lottery. It's not very likely.
So anything else though, we had, we brought up David Hayward earlier, and we had David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, who cartoons, right? And he's drawn hundreds of cartoons. And John asked him sort of the same question, like, how do you stay inspired? And he's like, I do this every day, whether I'm inspired or not. And I throw away 90% of it. He goes, if I end up with 100 cartoons that are worthy of publication, great. there's 300 or 400 or 500 that are like, I was off that day. But the discipline is in just doing it all the time, just doing it. I think that's one thing that even, people who write prose, I think we come into it naively as well. Go, well, I'm just going to write this book, and it's, how hard could it be? And then the editing process hits you square in the face and says, okay, now this can't be a 500-page book. It has to be, you need to trim some fat. So the discipline thing is important.
Oh, yeah. Well, one thing, if I waited to write when I was inspired, I wouldn't have published 5 books, because it turns out there's a video on YouTube I haven't seen yet, kind of distracted. So you really have to book time to like just do it. And it's also kind of a misapprehension where people think, oh, I would write, but I don't know what to say. I'm stuck. I have writer's block. And actually, that's really backwards. Where what if I told you, you don't write because you had a thought? What if you think by writing? And I'm a big fan of just write every day, right? And writing makes your thinking better.
That's a good point. That's a really good point.
Whether you have meteoric success in the field or not, I'm telling you, if you sit down and write a page every day, not only will it tell you, will you have thoughts to think about, there'll be better thoughts, and you'll know yourself better, and will have all these advantages.
That's good advice, man. I like that. That was something similar to what my friend Meg told me when I was beginning to write. Was something very, she's like, yeah, same thing. I mean, you work these things out through the process of writing, and you shape your ideas and you hone them, and but if you sit down and wait for that spark, you might sit down and wait for a year or 2, or it may never strike.
Yeah. Also, in terms of writing advice, one thing I have to say, go to the thing that really gets you excited. And maybe it's embarrassing, or maybe you don't want your parents to know about it. But to write well, you have to go to that thing that really excites you, whatever it is, right? It's like, for example, I really like The Godfather, and I know everything about it. But the thing is, I'm not Italian, and I'm never going to be. So if I wrote a mafia epic, you'd read it and go, this isn't authentic. This isn't your story. This isn't your world, right? So now,
right, exactly.
Over the course of my 5 books, I have found certain things that I'm really passionate about. Like the East End of Hamilton is kind of like a Baltimore-Pittsburgh vibe with, or like Syracuse when like Bethlehem Steel shut down. And I wanted to talk about that. And the cliche in good writing is that the more specific you get, the more universal you get. So by digging deep into one spot and choosing the right details, that was the best way to sketch out a problem. I ended up talking about something that a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere can actually relate to, because what's happening here is happening in other places. So it's a thing about what you said about poetry, a person saying, oh, I wrote this poem in the heat of inspiration. You've got to like it because my mom liked it. You always have to remember it's about communication, right? And sometimes you have a temptation to use a fancy word just because you know it. And you want to show off and tell the world you're a smart guy, or you want to shoehorn in the research you did, because otherwise it'll be a waste when it kills the flow. So always remember, it's always about communication, right?
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, and I can't even explain why it's come to mind as something that kind of fits into what you're talking about. It's like, if you're being specific, you create a scenario that seems to be even more universal. So the song, which a lot of songwriters are poets, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is a very specific song, right? It's a very, very specific moment in time, but it seemed to be so universal. And I think that's why it like caught on so well, and people really admired it and really caught on and attached themselves to that song. Because the lines are very specific about a very specific moment, but they're universal about death, tragedy, fear, all those things, right?
See, what you said there, I think that's a pretty important point that could be really helpful for a lot of our listeners, in the sense that you'll hear people say like, oh, I want to be a writer, but I want to write a novel, but I don't have a big idea. And they see like The Hunt for Red October and go, wow, that's a big idea. I want to just sit here on the couch and wait until, the angel Gabriel just gives me a great idea like that. And what we have to tell people is originality is overrated. Originality doesn't matter. Okay. So William Shakespeare wrote almost 40 plays. There was maybe one of them that had an original plot. All the other plots he stole from either history or inferior writers. And like most of his plots, the plot is, revenge. It's the same plot as like a Chuck Norris movie from the 80s, but that's all he needs, right? Because Shakespeare, it isn't about the originality of the plot. It's about the insights into the human experience you get along the way. And it's kind of funny. Like, I seem to relate everything back to this motion picture called The Wild Bunch, where there's a bit in the movie where in the middle of the movie, they blow up a bridge. And the way the script is structured, it's a big sort of like payoff at the end of the second act. And it's kind of a turning point. And when they were doing it, they said to Sam Peckinpah, you can't blow up a bridge because the movie stars William Holden. And 10 years ago, he had blown up the bridge on the River Kwai. And just last year, Sergio Leone blew up a bridge in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You can't blow up a bridge, right? And then Sam Peckinpah says, that doesn't matter. What matters is how you blow up a bridge. And it's certainly true, right? It's like, how many movies have there been made about a heist that went wrong? And how many more, how many more will there be? Like, don't worry about that. Just start writing.
Well, and I just absolutely love that The Wild Bunch has just made it into this podcast because that's one of my all-time favorite movies. I love that movie.
So wait, that's a motion picture you're speaking of, John?
Yes, it's a motion picture.
Yeah.
That's a piece of cinema.
Some of us call them talkies.
Oh, talkies.
Yeah.
I stopped watching I figured once they put sound into movies, I was done. Like, there's nothing left. Who's in The Wild Bunch? Remind me.
For me, the name that sticks out for me.
Who's in it?
Well, I'm telling you, for me, the one that stands out for me is Ernest Borgnine.
Ernest Borgnine's in The Wild. Okay. All right. I do love Ernest Borgnine, although my knowledge of his work doesn't extend beyond Airwolf.
Yes, he was an Airwolf.
See, I'm going to get kind of misty-eyed here thinking about the cast of The Wild Bunch. First off, since you brought up Ernest Borgnine, I'm not sure how much time you kids have, but basically, Ernest Borgnine, he won the Best Actor Oscar for the first movie he was ever in.
He did? I did not know that.
Check out this. The movie's called Marty. And
okay.
And the joke is he beat out Montgomery Clift, Spencer Tracy, James Dean, and someone else. So then on Oscar night, Ernest Borgnine said, the good news is I won the Oscar. The bad news is no one's ever going to believe me.
And he's not wrong.
And it's so wild because, George C. Scott, one time he was complimented on his acting and he brushed it off and he said 90% of good acting is good casting. Okay.
Right.
Where the thing is, when you watch the movie Marty, it's about a guy who's going on a date with a lady. And if this movie was starred Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise, there wouldn't be any suspense because, well, the guy looks like a hunk. It's going to work out. Like, chicks dig Brad Pitt. This isn't a mystery. But the whole point of Marty is it's two people who don't look like movie stars. And Ernest Borgnine plays a butcher who lives with his mom who looks like Ernest Borgnine. So you get the impression that if this blind date doesn't work out, it's going to be his last chance. So it actually has this urgency to it. So it's really thrilling about how in that form of storytelling, casting is so important. And The Wild Bunch is a movie that is perfectly cast. And Ernest Borgnine also lived to be almost 100, was in dozens of movies. And he said, and they said to him, what's your secret to having a long, healthy, joyful life? And he said, always say yes. He said, whenever the phone rings, pick it up. And no matter what it is, always say yes. So he was in Escape from New York with Kurt Russell. He was in the Devil's Reign with William Shatner, where he played a Satanist. He was in The Wild Bunch. He was an Airwolf. And sometimes he'd be in a piece of crap, and sometimes he'd be in the best movie ever made, right? So Borgnine said, always say yes.
And for all you young kids, because, we got a lot of young kids listening to this podcast. For all you young kids who are like Ernest Borgnine, he played Mermaid Man in SpongeBob SquarePants.
That's right.
Well, I knew he had an illustrious career. This is a strange segue, but stick with me. Since we're on the Ernest Borgnine kick, and I'm not sure how we got there, but I love it. John and I have a buddy who's written a few books. His name is John Lynch. And John Lynch, when he was a young man, was a fan of Ernest Borgnine somewhat, but he and all his friends created something they called the Ernest Borgnine Memorial Music Appreciation Society. And they would have this long weekend where they would hang around and they would sing songs and play cards and do what they did. And they actually got Ernest Borgnine to come to it. But they would play the theme song from McHale's Navy. they would smoke cigars. There'd be a picture of Ernest Borgnine on the piano. Anyway, I just thought that was really cool. I mean, that they reached out to his publicists at some point. We're like, hey, we just thought we'd let Ernest know this. And he was so moved by it. He came for like their 10th annual weekend and hung out with them. So Ernest Borgnine, if you want to come on the podcast, he's passed on, hasn't he?
He's passed on, yes.
Unfortunately.
Hey,
yes.
So on our next episode, we'll have a seance. And we will invoke the spirit of... Anyway, no, we won't do that. But I've been flipping through your book, and one thing that you mentioned at the top of the podcast was that you had injected some humor into your poetry, and that I think that for me, as I was reading through there, I pick up on these things, and I think they're really great. Can I read something? I'll do one lame poetry reading, and then maybe I'll get you to read one of yours. But I really like the Law of Suffering, just because it starts out. And so it says, the wind that hounded me was God's own breath. The fiery flowers of the marigold were God's eyes. You should always glide just above or shimmy just below the ambush. And leaping roof to roof isn't that easy in real life. All this I learned the hard way. That last line, man. So you're setting me up the whole time with this. I love the fiery flowers of the marigold were God's eyes, and the use of imagery of shimmy and ambush and all that stuff. And you just get me with this. But all this stuff, I learned all this the hard way. So apparently, jumping from roof to roof, not as easy as it sounds. So that's one of your shorter poems, and I don't do poetry reading, so I hope I did it a tiny bit of justice. But
that's pretty good.
See, that's the thing. When I speak of like poetic literacy, I mean. I count myself as chief among those. You know what I mean? I can read something like that and appreciate it and go, okay, that's cool. But as far as reading it or performing it as a poet would, putting the right intonation where they should be, or even understanding the meter and all that stuff that goes in. So I think a lot of us are sitting there going, I like poetry. I just don't know enough about it to be a knowledgeable consumer of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of sad in the one sense, I wish I could snap my fingers and everyone would be a nerd like me and the same cool stuff I am. But I guess it's not going to happen. So in the meantime, an artist has this issue about, like I said, you have to do your homework. But at the same time, you always have to remember it's about communication, right? So I can tell you my literary influences or who I'm alluding to, and you can look them up, and that's great. But at the same time, I think there are people like you in the world who, even if you haven't done all that, will get it and get something out of it. And also, a big part of art, too, is making sure the wires don't show. Like, to make really good art, you have to do your homework and have all these effects in play. Like, for example, in that poem you just read, I thought a lot about word choice, pacing, and I was in the zone of, I always wrote poems that were 24 lines long. And then I was writing this poem thinking, okay, I've got to write a poem that's 24 lines long. Then I wrote those 5 lines. And I looked at it and said, are we done here? I think we're done here. Also, a lot of writers never learn when to shut the hell up and let the story talk for itself, right?
That's true. I mean, that because when you're speaking about editing and things like that, I mean, that to me, and I know there are epic poems that are massive and long, and right, we could talk about those, but poetry to me always struck me as sort of the same vein as a good short story. Like it has to be succinct. It has to drive a point home, and you have to know when to stop, because you're not writing a novel, right? You're writing, maybe sometimes just a handful of lines that you hope to convey a thought or 2 or 3 that are powerful. So that's difficult. It's kind of like talking to David and talking about drawing cartoons that were like, man, on their face they're very simple, but man, they're not easy. You know what I mean? They might appear simplistic, but they're not. Right?
Yeah, but the same principle always applies where you don't want to sketch in more lines than are absolutely necessary to sell the cartoon or whatever. And there's some good advice from David Mamet, and David Mamet wrote Glengarry Glen Ross.
Ooh, I love that, yeah.
He once said, most important thing for writing, arrive late, leave early.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, it's so important. First off, let's say you're writing a scene about, or a movie about a gang of bank robbers, and they walk in the room and say, "Hello, Tom. I like robbing banks. Really, I like robbing banks too. Perhaps you should rob this bank at the corner of Scott and Vine tomorrow, 12. I'm new in town." So am I. Right? That's not very authentic sounding, right? So just imagine if you write that whole scene, but then you just skip those first pages and just have the audience enter the scene when it's already in progress. So instead of doing that, Tom says, "Did you bring the stuff?" And then Jim says, "I said I would bring the stuff. Why do you think I wouldn't bring the stuff? The stuff's right here. We've already been through this." And then Tom's like, "So you're ready then? You got the car?" And he's like, "What do you think?" Right? First off, just doing it that way has a little bit more verisimilitude, so it's easier to sell to the audience. Plus, by the reader having to rush or pay or do work to get up to speed, that increases the interest level. Okay. Also, if you're writing something, whether it's a novel or a poem or a song, and let's say all of the ligaments and rebar of the structure of it are all leading towards this one final note, and then you end the story just a semitone before that, and just say it's over, and then the audience is like, "Well, what did she say then when he said that?" Right? What happened next? And then they have to think about it on the car ride home. And that's when you have a chance to make art that's truly haunting. And if you say what happened next, or you tell me what it means, right? That's not art. That's something called propaganda, where propaganda is a form of expression that can only mean one thing, like vote for Tom or whatever, right? But for art to work, it has to mean different things to different people, where they can plug in their own experiences to it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And again, maybe you want to write a poem about your heartbreak, and I say go for it. Like that's what Shakespeare did. That's something that's a universal. Just like tell me something that I don't know, like your experience about it, right? But arrive late and leave early.
For me, like a really good movie leaves me questioning or trying to decide what happened the moment after the movie ended.
Yeah.
They didn't give it to me. They didn't give me that moment, but I now have to like interpret where I think it went for, or a really good story, right? Where they leave me, I want to be left wanting more of the story, but then I have to invent it on my own. I have to come up with a conclusion on where it went, Of Mice and Men. Of Mice and Men is a really good one, right? You just like, you're left at a point where you're like, yeah, but what happens after all all the shit hits the fan, right? I want to know what happened to the remaining people.
Yeah, but Steinbeck's not going to give you that.
Right. And then, so you're forced to fill in the gaps on your own. And I think that's way better than using propaganda, like you say, or force feeding, either a happy ending into a story that doesn't deserve it, or an ending at all that you expect it to go to. Right. I really appreciate anything that can do that, where it makes me, when I say you leave the movie theater, or you close the book, or you finish the poem, and then you still are in that moment for minutes, hours, maybe days. And that's the beauty of really good writing, I think.
Yeah. Also, people tend to perform either up or down to your expectations. So I'm a big fan of never talking down to your reader. Always talk up to them. Where sometimes I'll be writing and I'll think to myself, well, who else will understand this reference? What do I do? And I'm like, just go for it. Anyone who buys my book has access to like Google. They can figure it out, right?
Yeah.
And I certainly remember when I was a precocious youngster reading something that I didn't get and researching it and looking it up. And, that's all part of the magic and the fun too, right? Yeah. Also, this reminds me of an amusing anecdote involving the Wild Bunch. So not only was Sam Peckinpah a great writer, director, and one of the best editors, he was also one of the best loopers ever. Sam Peckinpah was a master looper. And it turned out before the Wild Bunch, he made a movie called Major Dundee. That was the first time where a major studio in Hollywood had natives who were played by actual natives from the actual right tribes. And before that, when they had American Indians in big movies, they would put some shoe polish on Ricardo Montalban and say, yeah, that's like close enough. Who cares? Right. And Sam Peckinpah cared enough to get actual indigenous people from the right tribes. And so before the Wild Bunch, every Warner Brothers Western movie, all the guns sound the same. And Sam Peckinpah said, wait a minute, a Winchester 73 sounds different than a Smith & Wesson from 1912. So he actually went back and did all the looping. So all of the gunshots sounded accurate. And his parents were literal pioneers who were some of the first people to come out to those mountains north of Fresno or something. And Ben Johnson, who played one of the Gorch brothers in the Wild Bunch, was an actual rodeo rider and a trick rider and a stuntman before he became an actor. And John Ford made a John Wayne movie in the 1940s where there's a bit where Ben Johnson, who was in the Wild Bunch, he actually does this bit where he's riding two horses at once with one foot on one horse, another foot on the other. So these guys grew up putting horseshoes on horses. So that's an authenticity kind of thing,
Yeah, for sure. Well, that has to come into play in all the stuff you mentioned, making references and things like that to things that maybe not everybody's going to get. But you trying to force a reference into something that's not really in your wheelhouse would come off as inauthentic. I think I'd much rather go, man, I wonder what he means by that, and do a tiny bit of looking up, to find out what that's about. That makes a lot more sense. And I don't know. I love all this, man. Let's talk about the theme of your book. So I don't want to lose sight of the book too much. Is there an overarching? What you did write a book, Permanent Smoke. It is available on that place that we don't talk about much, but all right, fine. Jeff Bezos might get some more of your money, but you should order it if you can. We want to support boutique publishing houses like Quoir and guys out there who are doing the work. But is there an overarching kind of theme to the book, Permanent Smoke, or is there a direction that your poetry is leading in specific?
There certainly is. This is my fifth book, like I said, and when I wrote my first book, there had a lot of sort of autobiographical material in there because that's natural. When you start writing, you kind of use the detritus of your own mistakes, your own messed up life as raw material. And then when I had a chance for a second book, I thought, wow, one thing I know, I really don't want to do that again. I really don't want to talk about myself or my feelings. because I have to make up feelings. I don't have feelings. What? And one thing I was really interested in was about how your physical environment affects your mental real estate and how your surroundings impact your thoughts and your person in all these ways, right? And like, Stephen King has 50 novels that take place in Maine because he lives in Maine, right?
Right.
Like why set his novels in Paris, doesn't live there, right? And Faulkner had those novels set in that fictional one in the county, right? And so I thought it was interesting to talk about that. And then it also turned out that the specific place I live, I had some love for, and a lot of interesting things are going on here. So I thought it'd be neat to talk about what's going on in Ward 3 in East Hamilton. And but to do it in a sort of oblique way, like hitting it from the side with humor and with surrealist jokes, so the message was kind of hidden. Also, I was concerned about how technology is changing us, is warping our communities, our personalities, our culture in all these ways, right? And if you just talk about that directly, it's like, oh yeah, this is like the Unabomber manifesto. That's what Ted said back in the day, right? So you just sound like a crackpot, right? So I just thought if it's wrapped up in poetry, it's sort of easier to get under people's defenses. So part of it is about what do you do when you lose your manufacturing jobs? Also, what do you do? This is a big theme too in the 5 books. What do you do when the simulacra becomes more persuasive than the real deal, which is a huge problem? Like, for example, if you gentlemen fall in love with a lady, that involves risk. And now in the Western Hemisphere, there is about 100 million men who've said, yeah, I'm not sure I want to take that risk. So instead, I'll just go for this digital substitute, which isn't great, but it's less risky, if you know what I mean. I'm trying to keep it PG here, kids.
Hey, you don't have to do that, man. It's cool.
Okay, great. Also, Jesus said, love your neighbor. But now, due to changes in technology, my neighbor never goes outside. Your neighbor stays in his mom's basement 24 hours a day playing video games. So how can you love your neighbor if he never goes outside? So, these changes in technology have totally atomized our communities where people don't even understand what a community is because they've never had that experience, So that's kind of like alarming, sure, And like I said, I would never dream of writing a nonfiction book about this because, I don't like listening to sermons, and I don't think that I think it's kind of naive to think that that approach would work because every sermon I've ever heard, I forgot it as soon as I left the building. And, with art, you get a chance to, when you go to great art, you go there because you want to be reminded of things that are universal, things that don't change, things that will things that are problems that every human will always have to wrestle with, It's a much, if you read good poetry, it's a much more elevated form of discourse than people talking about who you should vote for or something,
Well, yeah. I mean, no one ever read the Communist Manifesto or the Unabomber's Manifesto and went, gee, I wonder what it meant by that.
Yeah,
It's all pretty well spelled out. And, 1% of the population is going to be convinced by your argument. The rest are going to think you're a crackpot and dismiss you out of hand. I like that idea. Like you said, it's almost a little bit of subterfuge where you can introduce these topics in a backhanded kind of way, slide them in under the radar, and then get people thinking about things in a different way. And that's always what art does. It's what writers like Kafka did. It's what painters like Van Gogh and Picasso did. Get you to look at the world in a different way. Yeah, I think it's genius, and I think it's something that is sorely needed. So for that, man, we appreciate all of that. We are going to probably get close to wrapping this up, man. But it's been a joy I really have appreciated the conversation, Darrell.
Absolutely.
Give me a few more minutes. I'm desperate for attention here.
Absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
On the one hand, of course, poetry is a crapshoot, but at the same time, I always think like the poetry of Isaiah and Homer have lasted 3,000 years, and will my clever tweets fare as well as that, right? It seems unlikely, right? And it's like, when Emily Dickinson was writing her poetry, which is pretty wild stuff, the Civil War was raging around her, right? And of course, she never wrote about the Civil War. And you think, wow, isn't that odd? Shouldn't she have been using her skills as a writer to write letters to the editor saying, slavery sucks, right? It's like, well, no, I know slavery sucks. I know war is bad, right? That's not exactly some new thing, right? But Emily Dickinson on a good day does get to this, razor sharp edge of what it means to be alive in a way that transcends like the current events news cycle. So it's kind of an interesting problem. Also, one thing, any aspiring writer who's listening, there was a poet from Baltimore named Edgar Allan Poe, and he once wrote a poem called Alone. And that's a poem that back in the day really knocked me out. And this poem has everything I wanted in a good poem. It has a great first line, a great last line, and imagery that is vivid and fresh and isn't things you'd thought of before, and really takes you on a ride. Has a great last line. It's awesome. And it feels, when you read it, as if you're hearing like a cry of a soul, as if this guy's just like in torment and he's spilling his guts to you. Like, the muse came to him and it's like, oh, I have these intense feelings, right? But if you actually break it down, that poem is actually bursting with craft and structure. But, and it's all in there. But he just really did his homework. So there are effects in that poem which you won't dig until like the fourth time you've read it. And that's what we're shooting for. If you want to be a writer, go for it, but just keep on pushing yourself to get better. And remember, like, you want to be on the shelf next to Homer or whoever, right?
Yeah, or Poe. I mean, that's good company to be in. I'm actually looking at the poem Alone right now, and it's awesome.
And it's funny. It's like he says, like, ever since I was young, I have not been as others have been. So a young person reads that and says, oh, wow, that's my story. Like it's relatable. And then like the last line is like scary because it's so fresh and is an image you've never seen in a poem before, where it sounds like a diary entry or this real intense wave of motion. And then he says, a demon's in my view. You're like, what?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm reading through this going, wow. So she starts off, like you said, from childhood hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others. I always loved Poe's rhyming schemes. I don't know that I'm sure what he's using here has a name, what kind of meter he's using. But I've always loved that about Poe, that it would just about suck you into thinking you knew how to like the next line was going to go, and then he'd switch it up on you.
Yeah,
yeah. John and I grew up with our father is a writer and a poet, and so we were exposed to Poe from the cradle, practically, right, John? I mean, Poe was what Dad loved. Dad loved Poe, and as far as writers went, he was a sci-fi guy, so it was always Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov and those are the kinds of things we grew up reading from the time we could read. And so Edgar Allan Poe has always figured pretty large in my imagination as just the great classic American poet.
That's fantastic. Wow. Yeah. Right on.
Yeah, we're fortunate. I mean, we didn't do much with it, but no, I'm just kidding.
Well, and then for me, I mean, the poet for me that said, okay, you can break the rules and you can stretch the boundaries was E.E. Cummings. E.E. Cummings is my favorite poet. My favorite poem by him is one called "Gee, I Like to Think of Dead." He was the poet that gave me permission to not have to write in this, like, every line doesn't have to rhyme. Every line doesn't have to fit this meter. as long as you create an imagery that makes you want to continue within the poem, and you want to read, you want to find out where he's going with it. And so for me, that was a really good big breakthrough for me.
Also, Cummings was the master of the love poem, very much so.
Yeah.
But see, we're not as bad as we thought, John. We know a little bit about this stuff. I love bringing this this topic. You know, again, we always like to have different kinds of people on the podcast, and so this is nice that we've broken the mold from our normal set of authors to someone who's doing something different. And I like it. Permanent Smoke is the name of the book. You should buy it. Hell, buy a copy or two for yourself. Buy one or two for a friend. Spread the love. Buy 50 copies. Teach a class on it. You know, make this part of your curriculum. There's all kinds of stuff you can do here. We'll link to that in the show notes as well as anything else that Darrell has going on. But man, we appreciate you stopping by. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
What an awesome conversation. We enjoyed it thoroughly, man.
Well, I have to say, this has been so much fun for me, and my door is always open to you if you're in the neighborhood. This was just great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, we appreciate you, man.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.